Hello there. Today we're going to be talking about another battle from the ancient world, in this case the Battle of Granicus from 334 BC. This is the first battle Alexander fights in his Asian campaigns, and it's the first major pitched battle where he is in command. He's become king after the murder of Philip. He's moved into Thebes, taken the city by siege. There's been a lot of fighting there, and he's campaigned against the tribes on the northern borders, the Illyrians, Thracians, but there haven't been massed actions, pitched battles in quite that way. That's more mountain warfare and this sort of thing. He was present at Chaeronea, and modern scholars have always tended to assume he plays a very big role there, commands the cavalry on the right flank. The ancient sources are a lot less full. Most of this is extrapolated from them. He is supposed to have led the charge that broke the rank of the Theban sacred band. It doesn't say he did that on horseback. There was always this assumption, Alexander, well, he always leads the companions and he always charges on horseback, and it's the same tactics. There is a great danger that we impose this order on the Chaeronea, but then the battles in Asia of Alexander's always on the right with the companions. You stretch out the enemy to the right a bit, you try and look for a weak spot in their line or stretch them out, create a gap, and then Alexander steams straight forward into that gap and breaks up the army that way. Because you can argue that for Gaugamela, but it's not quite so clear in Issus and in Granicus, only in a very loose sense. And it rather suggests that the army that Philip II of Macedonia has created, that Alexander leads against the Persians, is essentially a sort of one-trick team that just has this one idea, this one tactic, and it imposes that every time. Key thing to emphasize at the start is that Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, and later on the Hydaspes, those are the four big battles Alexander fights. That's only four in more than a dozen years of campaigning. And you add in Chaeronea, there's a fifth battle that he experiences during his lifetime. He fights an awful lot, but there are far more sieges, there are far more raids, there is far more of this sort of mountain warfare, fighting your way through a pass, dealing with ambushes, raids, this type of thing. So Alexander fights a lot and he gets wounded far more often in those sorts of actions, just as Philip did, than in the big battles. So big battles are fairly rare. They are important. They are not the only thing that decides the war, but they play a very big factor, because when you win one, not only does it inflict serious losses in manpower on the enemy field army, it also tends to devastate their morale as well. So we won't go too much into the broader context of why Alexander is attacking Persia. That's something for another day we can talk about. And again, you've got my Philip and Alexander as my take on all of these, and there is no shortage of Alexander the Great books out there. So there's plenty of other stuff to look at if you want more on that. Today we want to just look at this one battle that is the smallest, really, of Alexander's battles. It's the first. It's not a tiny battle, but it isn't as big as they will become. Philip has begun the war in the east and already sent troops across in 336 BC. An advance guard has landed in Asia Minor. You don't go by sea other than by across the Dardanelles, that last part, because the Persians have a big navy and the Macedonians don't really have one. Alexander has gathered a navy from his Greek allies early on in the war, though in the aftermath of Granicus, or a little bit later, he will send most of it home and decide that he can't contest the war at sea. And then instead he'll take the enemy ports and deprive them of their naval power that way. Alexander's army that has joined the advance guard, that did quite well because it surprised the Persians in the first place, but has then been hemmed in and forced to retreat. So it holds on to an enclave. It means you can land on a safe beachhead, but you haven't got a lot of territory under your control. Alexander leads an army of around the core of the Macedonian army that has taken shape under Philip II, who'd reformed it drastically and then led it with great success. So this is an army based around the horse companions, the companion cavalry, and the foot companions, the various infantry, mostly more or less heavy infantry. The companion cavalry are primarily shock cavalry. They're in formations of 200, 300, depends on your interpretation, 250. They don't carry shields as far as we can tell under ordinary circumstances. They have body armor, they may have some leg armor as well. They've got helmets, and they use the Zyston, as we call it. Most modern applications of terms for ancient weapons are rather more precise than the ancients used them. So sometimes they refer to the sarissa of the cavalry. We associate the sarissa with the infantry, the two-handed pike held by the phalanx of the Macedonian troops that a large part of it projects ahead of you. So unlike Greek hoplites, they carry a smaller shield that's less maneuverable, but this longer-reached double-handed pike. It means they need to operate in close formation because you're very much dependent on the men either side of you and to some extent behind you to protect. Because obviously once somebody gets past the point, it's a very unwieldy weapon. But if they can't get past the point, they've got the whole idea is you have a row of spearheads coming towards you. And it keeps the enemy at a distance, maybe makes it harder for them to reach you unless they throw things at you. They've got to try and break the spear shafts, the points, get past them, dodge them somehow. It's not necessarily a great way for killing lots of enemies, but it's a way for pinning them and then grinding them down, and you stay in position and eventually they'll give way. You've got the Hydaspes, the hypaspists, the troops more associated with the king. Long argument about whether these are also pikemen or whether they're more like hoplites or whether they might do both, that tend to be the link between the main phalanx and the cavalry. You've got units of light cavalry, you've got allies, you've got the Thessalian horse that operate in a broadly similar way to your companion cavalry. That's the sort of the hard core of Philip's army. Now, the Thessalians are allies, but they tend to be more closely associated with the Macedonian components of the army, as do a few selected groups of Thracians, Illyrians, and others that provide lighter cavalry and light infantry. You've then got the Greek allies, provided by most of the states to a greater or lesser extent, have sent something. Some have sent ships more than soldiers. Spartans have obviously stood out of this, and later Alexander will send back this very sniffy dedication to Delphi, proclaiming these are the spoils taken from the Persians by all the Greeks apart from the Spartans. So you have an army whose numbers are not entirely clear. The sources differ and there's no real certainty. So perhaps the whole expeditionary force numbers about 50,000, perhaps it numbers a bit less, a bit more, 40,000, 55,000. It's very hard to say. We're not quite sure. They land in Asia Minor, and Alexander then he's carrying with him about a month's supply of food, but after that he has got to acquire sources of food for the men, food for the horses, supplies in general to feed the war effort, to keep that army in one place. So that's going to be a major headache in a sense, or at least a driving force behind the shaping of strategy, and that you've got to keep your army operational, and that means getting supplies for it. So they reinforce the enclave, and then they start to target the cities there, some of whom had defected to the Macedonians before, and in some cases have been recaptured or gone back to the Persians. Alexander can't go in with fire and sword everywhere and devastate them, A, because he needs them as ongoing sources of supply. Also, that's difficult, that's dangerous, and he doesn't want to take the time and the risks. He doesn't want any even minor defeats early on. So it's much better to persuade people to defect if he possibly can, and to give him food and other supplies he needs, and then move on to the next one, and hope, and also show people that, look, if you switch sides, if you join this Macedonian invader, he will be very kind and very generous to you. He will not mistreat you. So all the way through, there's a strong carrot and stick emphasis in the way he deals with local communities here and beyond, in that if they're willing to give in, if they're willing to accept his rule, accept him as king, then he will treat them very favorably. Yes, they'll have to give him some stuff, but he will not impose garrisons on them. He will not restrict their freedom to run their own affairs, and he will not bleed them dry so that they starve themselves. So Alexander is kind and generous from a pragmatic point of view. It is advantageous to him. This is part of the strategy. Win people over. On the other hand, if people do oppose him, if they do fight him, he is ruthless in punishing them. So that's a reminder that, look, we can be good friends, I can be nice to you, but I can also be very, very nasty if the time comes. Now, from the Persian perspective, Achaemenid Persia is a vast, vast empire. It has huge resources in manpower, in money, it can raise very large armies, but it's big. Nothing can happen quickly because you have to move those resources around, marshal them and arrange things. And even the news, Darius will have heard of the earlier invasion by a small force of Macedonians, but Philip's been murdered. Whether or not the Persians had anything to do with it, they'd certainly be pleased by the end result. You might then have expected, well, the really dangerous, warlike, successful king Philip is dead. He's succeeded by the young, insecure, unproven Alexander, so at the very least that should give me a breathing space. And it does for a short time, but by 334 Alexander has crossed to Asia and is there with his army, so he's followed up. But Alexander is an unknown quantity. Philip was a great war leader, though his expeditionary force, the advance guard of it, to Asia had not done all that much up to this point. And bear in mind, the Persians would have this memory of earlier expeditions. You could even think about the mercenaries, the 10,000 who are hired to come in and fight in Persia when they're on the losing side of the civil war, cut their way back home and fight their way back home, but they're not hanging around, they're not trying to conquer. And when there have been interventions by the Spartans in the earlier 4th century BC, these are limited in their objectives. Yes, they persuade some cities to defect, but they're not really there to conquer permanently and occupy very large stretches of territory. It's a bit more a protection racket, an extortion thing, right? You come to these cities and say, join us, give us money, or we'll be unpleasant to you. One basic truth was that those armies were not particularly good at sieges. Philip has revolutionized warfare by creating this force that can take walls, strongholds, that is willing to besiege them, wear them down, take them by assault, and doesn't quit. Greek armies hadn't had that capacity before. So if you look back at the past, you'd think of these interventions as a nuisance, but really large-scale banditry, large-scale plundering, more than anything else. Not attempts at conquest, certainly not attempts to reach the heartland of the Persian Empire and overthrow the king. That's not what the Greeks are doing. So all expectations from a Persian perspective would logically be that this is another one of those. So this is basically a large-scale raid. They want money from us, they want to plunder us, they're going to take some of particularly the Greek-speaking communities, but this isn't life or death. He isn't coming for me as great king. So on the one hand, you'd be thinking at this stage, well, it's going to be a nasty war. This is an annoying threat. This is a serious threat because this army has been quite good in the past. On the other hand, we don't know how good Alexander is going to be. But this is not something that requires all the resources of my empire to muster and to crush. Initial responsibility for dealing with this goes to the satraps of the regions affected and those nearby, and goes to the commanders on the spot. So you have the local satraps and noblemen, influential, some people with connections at court, elsewhere. We don't know a lot about any of them as individuals. We know rather more about Memnon of Rhodes, who's a Greek. He and his brother have been in Persian service for some time. He had been involved in a rebellion of one of the satraps, and when that failed, with that satrap had fled to the court of Philip II. So he's somebody who knew the Macedonians a bit. But then returns to the fold with the Persians and leads a force of about 5,000 or so hoplites, mercenary troops, basically many of them Greek or Greek style in their fighting. He is presented quite favourably in the sources, as probably because he's a Greek. He gives wise advice, the Persian aristocrats ignore him and they lose. And he is presented as a dangerous opponent. He argues that rather than mustering all their forces, then they should actually not confront Alexander in battle, but let hunger do their work for them. Hem them in, restrict them, and wait for the army to starve and just give up and go away. Now, with hindsight, that seems like a terribly wise thing to do, because One of the lessons of history would be not to fight Alexander the Great. It's like, don't take on Hannibal, don't take on Julius Caesar. These people tend to win. But of course, that's hindsight. Alexander the Great is not yet Alexander the Great. Just because we know what he's going to do and how spectacularly successful he's going to be, how incredibly gifted he will prove as a leader, as a tactician, as a strategist, that's not there all the time. It hasn't always been like that. And he is just a kid in his early 20s who's inherited the throne in the dubious circumstances of the murder of his father. Some people have said that he's behind it, or his mother's behind it, or both of them are behind it. He has been brutal in Greece. He's shown the Thebans they can't look at him the wrong way and oppose him. But again, that's just Greece. And he's dealt with tribes on his northern borders. Well, other kings have done that, not all. He's leading an army of veterans, which we'll come back to in a minute, Philip's men. But the army is proven, but he as their leader is not yet proven. So from the point of view of Memnon and somebody in 334, you could look and say, well, I've got an idea of just how tough Philip's army can be. I don't know so much about Alexander, but that army's a good one. Why fight them when we can win without doing that? We can just harass them. He's brought this 40,000, 50,000 or so men to Asia. Now he's got to feed them. Now he's got to supply them. Now he's got to keep those horses in a good state. And he's got to keep the morale together of this coalition. So make it difficult for him, harass him, deprive him of food, and the war will be won that way. So there is a logic to that, but there is also a thought that, well, this isn't Philip. And from the satrap's point of view, it's all very well Memnon saying, well, just let the fields, ravage our fields, destroy our crops. The satrap in charge of that region, it's his subjects that are going to suffer from this, that are going to starve as a result of the food being destroyed or confiscated. It's his communities that are going to be told, you've got to hold out against the Macedonians, or if not, we'll punish you severely. The price for this scorched earth tactics would be paid by his region, for which he's responsible, and if he becomes unpopular there, they might overthrow him, the great king might get suspicious of him and replace him. There is also the confidence. Memnon knows something about Macedonians and the Macedonian army and their record. Most of the Persians do not, and they've seen an expeditionary force, the vanguard, arrive, win some minor victories, but then suffer some defeats as well and be pushed back. So they don't have any reason in particular to fear Alexander. And there is also the moral element. You don't want your cities within this region to defect to the Macedonians and give them supplies. If you hang back and suggest that you're frightened of facing them in battle, then maybe people are going to think, well, they are really strong, and perhaps that's what we ought to do. We really ought to side with them because the Persians aren't going to protect us. And bear in mind, some of these communities have already changed sides to join the Macedonians and then changed back to join the Persians in the last year or so. And there has been rebellion. The fringes of the Persian Empire always are slightly problematic from the loyalty of the satraps, but also the communities there. So there's a lot of logic to it. We don't really know the forces they have at their disposal. By 334, by the summer of 334, they're credited with between 10 and 20,000 cavalry and 20,000 or so infantry. The forces they seem to have at the Battle of the Granicus. Those numbers are hard to assess, and we'll come on to some of the details when we get to the battle itself. But I think the best estimate is probably that they have maybe parity with Alexander's whole expeditionary force. They probably do not have a big numerical advantage at this stage. Later on, the Persians can get the numbers, but at this stage, they haven't yet got those. So we have to bear in mind that they've got a decent-sized army, but probably not a huge one. And they mass this at a place called Zelea, about 10 miles in from the coast, and then start to send patrol, try and find out what the Macedonians are doing. Alexander decides to advance on them. He's got to show confidence. He's got to convince everybody, I'm going to win, therefore change side, join me, and I'll be really nice to you. And that's how he's going to feed his army. And again, the truth of Alexander's campaigns all the way through, but particularly in the war against the great king of Persia, is that he can't afford to lose. He needs to go from victory to victory. He needs to make progress because he has everything to prove. Again, we know he's going to win spectacularly, but people at the time didn't. He's just some upstart. Remember Macedonia, even boosted by Philip, is still a minor power as far as the Persians are concerned, as far as many of the other folk within the Persian Empire are concerned. No one would have expected them to do what Alexander is going to go on and do. He decides, and this probably has to do with logistics more than anything else, he will advance towards this Persian army that's been mustered by the satraps and by Memnon, but he only takes the core of his army, the sort of the best bits. So it's predominantly the Macedonians, plus the Thessalians, plus a few others. So he probably takes 20,000 or so, 25,000 maybe, no. So he doesn't take the entire 40, 50,000. It may not be so much that he hasn't got food to feed all of them, but at this stage he may not have enough transport animals to carry that food. It's also, if he's going to risk an encounter, let's do it with the very best of his troops. This is Philip's army. This is the team that's fought side by side and won lots of times in the past, really knows what it's doing. And it is very much Philip's army. It's led by Philip's commanders like Parmenio. Later on, Justin will claim that Alexander specifically picked the veterans, the older soldiers, that this was quite a mature army when it marched out. You know, we always associate combat and warfare these days with the very young, but this is bearded men, fathers of children, this sort of thing, established men, but very experienced. These are people who've won lots of times. There are some of Alexander's contemporaries dotted around, usually more junior posts and around him, but essentially this is Philip's army led by their new king, who has to prove himself. And they're used to winning, but they haven't won under him yet. So there's a lot riding on this, and it may also be an emphasis on, well, you are special, you are my hetairai, you are my companions. We're all in this together, we're all Macedonians. Yes, I'm your king and I go first, but I go first and I seek danger first alongside you, because we're all in this together, because we are all Macedonians, with sort of honorary Macedonians like the Thessalians there as well. But again, it's the pick of the army. So there might be logistical reasons. There might also be an element of, I want to win with this. And it may reflect his reports of the size of the Persian army, that he doesn't think he needs absolutely everybody at this point. They advance towards them and they eventually find the Persians mustered behind the river Granicus. Now, when it comes to locating the battlefield precisely, it's a little hard to be precise. I haven't yet seen the details. I know there was a Turkish team recently that claimed they did think they'd narrowed it down and they'd located the actual battle site. I haven't seen the details of all of that. Instinct is that people who are on the spot and working in the area have the best chance of doing this. But again, I don't know the arguments yet, so I haven't seen that. One of the big problems will be establishing, even if we get the right location, exactly what the river Granicus was like in 334. So rivers change, they get channeled, farmers adjust the banks, all of this sort of thing. So we can't, every battle plan, including the ones I'll use here, which come from my book, they'll be stylized to give an idea. It probably in those days was a broader, shallower river. It flows north from the mountains towards the sea. Early in the late spring, early summer, you'll get a lot of snow melting, a lot of water in that. So it's probably fast flowing, fairly strong current, but wider than we're associating, than we tend to think of many rivers that have been channeled and controlled for the purposes of stopping them flooding in more recent centuries. Some shale, some harder pits on the bottom of it, on the bed, but also some clay that could get very muddy, very clingy, especially when churned up by all these horses and all these men that are going to go through it in the battle. It was a known crossing place of the river, so there must have been at least one relatively easy ford that was viable for transport for wagons as well as for individuals and animals, perhaps more than one. The bank on the eastern, the Persian-held side, quite steep, not massive, not sort of cliffs, but nevertheless steep, with presumably access points by the main crossing ones, but probably others where, even if it's individuals use it, that's the way you always go if you want to go down and fish, if you want to go down and swim or cross or wash your clothes or whatever it might be, and just from where the rain has flowed. So you have the river Granicus. The Persians are positioned behind it. If we look at our plan, heavily stylized, but let's go through what the armies are. So left to right with the Macedonians, you'll have the Thessalian cavalry, some Greek cavalry, Thracians, then the regiments of the phalanx named under their commander. Arrian repeatedly talks about the Macedonian army having an order of march for the day, and it seems to imply there's some rotation in who gets the lead off the column, depending on the day, but it's all predictable, regimented, organized. All of this has come from Philip, or at least been crystallized under Philip. It's become far more efficient. You've got the prodomoi, then one squadron of companion cavalry, have I missed off the hypaspists? Yeah, I think this was one of the errors on the map, so this might be an earlier draft. We'll see if we can put that in. There to the right of the main phalanx units. Yeah, I've missed out six. You've got an extra phalanx regiment plus the pick of the bunch. It'll be 6 and then 7 marked in as their units. And then you've got the prodomoi, you've got the Socrates companion cavalry, the other 7 squadrons, Cretan archers, and light infantry, Agrianians. Facing them, you've got a Persian army that, depending on the source, Arrian says 20,000 cavalry, Diodorus says 10,000. Pays your money, takes your choice, really. There isn't a simple way of saying which one is right. Behind that, 20,000 infantry. The best of these are the Greek mercenaries, the hoplites, at least Greek style. You know, there may be Lydians and others, Carians and people like that amongst them who are used to fighting in the same way, and other people have just got the equipment, but a lot of Greeks too. They're the pick of the bunch. Often this is expanded to 20,000 of those, and you can read Arrian that implies that. On the other hand, that's a lot. Maybe it's right, but maybe it's 20,000 infantry, of which the best part are the Greek hoplites. They, however, are left behind. We'll go back to the deployment in a moment. Let's just look at the situation. Alexander advances there, comes there during the day. He doesn't arrive, camp, and think about things, though there is one later tradition that claims that he does. He comes to approach the river. The army deploys from its march column, and while it's doing that, he consults with his senior officers, and you get the pattern you'll have where experienced heads, older heads advise caution. Alexander ignores them and it's proved to be right and wins. Often focuses around Parmenio, as it does here, where he says, well, let's camp, let's think about an assault crossing tomorrow. And Alexander assures them that he declared that he'd blush for shame after crossing the Hellespont. If having crossed that strait, he should be afraid of the Granicus, plunged into the stream with 13 troops of horsemen. That's the Plutarch version, exaggerates it even more. There is a tradition later on that comes via Diodorus that in fact he does stop for the night, and then this has been taken, people have said, oh, this is far more plausible. He actually crosses the river further down, further down, or further upstream, closer towards the mountains anyway, inland. Sorry, my brain isn't quite functioning this morning. And then people have said, well, this means he hits the Persians in the flank and that's why he wins and he doesn't do this assault crossing. That's to ignore the much fuller account in Arrian, and there doesn't seem any particular reason to do that. For several reasons. First of all, this is Alexander who wants to win. And he wants to win spectacularly. There's very much, there is you could say this is true of most sporting contests as well, but it's particularly true in war. How the early encounters go tend to affect the morale in a very big way. So if you start by winning, then you feel better, you feel confident, you believe that you can crush the enemy, that you're going to beat them. If you start by losing even some minor actions, rumour quickly spreads that the enemy are all 6'6", massive, really stealthy, really clever, really ferocious, fanatically brave, all this sort of thing. So there's a lot to be said for Alexander wanting to impose his will. emphasize his superiority, show I'm better than you, and tell the men we are better than them and we are going to win right from the very start. The aggression does fit with Alexander. And there's an element, he's arrived midway through the day. There is at least half a day's worth of daylight, something like that, left. So it's a long time to wait. There is clearly sufficient time for the army to deploy from march column, wheel around, form line of battle. Presumably they're marching so that they can basically wheel to the right and everybody is in the position where they would then be in the battle line, or near enough. But that's going to take an hour or two. What's interesting, and I think generally ignored when people look at this battle, is what the Persians are up to. It is very common in the ancient world for armies to march into close contact with each other and then sit and stare at each other for days, even weeks, before they fight, or sometimes then withdraw without doing so. Philip at Chaeronea has spent weeks before he will commit to battle, staring at the Greek army, and they've stared back at him. So normally, commanders are expected to be very cautious about accepting any sort of disadvantage. And this will become much more highly developed in the Hellenistic military manuals and later into the Roman period, where the emphasis is on gaining as many edges over the enemy as you possibly can. Obviously, being upslope, that helps. Having the sun in the enemy's eyes, that helps. Having the wind blowing towards the enemy away from you takes force from their missiles, adds it to yours. If it blows dust in their eyes, even better. Fight on particular terrain that suits your troops more than his. You've got more cavalry, you want more open country. You've got more infantry, you want more broken country, and so on and so on. That mentality has always been there. Fight at an advantage. So the Persians will be comfortably ensconced behind this river, and they will not expect the Macedonians to come straight at them. Come back to the map. As the deployment is explained, the Persian infantry is way at the back on high ground. Good position to observe, but it means that they're not involved in any initial encounter. What you've got on the plain between the river and that high ground is the massed Persian cavalry. Cavalry, by their very nature, are not a defensive arm. They are not troops that can stand in one spot and hold ground. If you had wanted to defend this river line, if you were expecting the Macedonians to attack you, then this deployment would be reversed. You'd have your infantry up front on or very near the riverbank to make it hard for the enemy. Fight the enemy when their formation is broken, when they're trying to surge up, and even the advantage of that few feet in height is going to be a big deal. Infantry can stand where they are and stay where they are and fight toe-to-toe with enemy. Cavalry don't do that. Cavalry are effective because of their mobility. That's particularly true for the Persian cavalry and the various groups. You've got Bactrians, Medes, Hyrcanians, Paphlagonians, and others, the various ethnic groups that are specified that are there. These are, in the main, not shock cavalry. These are cavalrymen who will throw javelins, in a few cases shoot bows, but mainly it's thrown missiles that are the big force. And then when they've weakened the enemy, when the enemy's scattered, when the enemy's looking a bit shaky, then they will charge in and fight sword, spear, or club in hand. But their primary aim is not like the Campanian cavalry. It's not to charge home right from the beginning. But to do any of this, yes, you could say, oh, well, they're up on the bank, they can be throwing missiles at the Macedonians as they cross. Well, yes, but then infantry could do that better. Cavalry, you get more force to the missile there. It's a question of surging forward, whirling towards the enemy, throwing missiles, clearing off before he can catch you, and then doing it again from another direction. One big thing that I tried to represent in this diagram is that we tend to make the mistake. Most maps of battles will show very large blocks, solid blocks of cavalry formations. That's not how cavalry fight. Putting them in a big block like the Rohirrim in the Return of the King movie when they arrive outside Minas Tirith for the Pelennor Fields in these massive, great deep phalanxes is just a waste. It looks spectacular, but it's nonsense. All you do is turn them into a big herd that is inclined to stampede either forwards or backwards. There'd be no control. You would get no great advantage from those numbers because they can't do anything and they're very hard to control. Cavalry throughout history has tended to break down into smaller subunits. So again, let's think about the Macedonian Campanian cavalry. Famously, they used a wedge-shaped formation. This is a representation of it where you've got one rider, the unit leader at the front, 2 men behind him, 3 men behind that, and you go back and back, increasing the number so that it's very maneuverable. You can basically, as the leader swerves to either side, you can follow him, and it also looks pretty intimidating to anyone you're charging, because 1 or 2 people in that line are going to think this charge is coming directly at them, and the instinct is to try and move a bit out of the way so somebody else has to deal with that rather than you. So there's a tendency it can break up a formation on a psychological basis through fear, through shock. I've shown this wedge with 55 men in. Now the Hellenistic manuals that talk about this describe it on that sort of scale. Now, an ile of cavalry, depending on which source you go for, could be 200, 250, 300 men in it, possibly even larger. It depends how you interpret the overall number and divide it up between the royal squadron and the others. A wedge of that number of people ending in 1 person at the point is cumbersome. You're going to lose all the advantages you've got from this formation. So what I suspect is more likely is this idea where you've got 4 of these wedges, so you've got a unit of 200 plus, as individual troops, like the troops of a 17th century cavalry regiment, 18th, 19th century. You've got smaller blocks that can then be deployed in relation to each other. Now, this to me makes more sense of how the Macedonian cavalry work, how the Thessalians, who are forming a rhombus instead of a triangle, do this, and even those cavalry that form rectangles. Not one big formation for the entire regiment, but several that can be mutually supporting, that allow you to direct the attack rather more. It allows you to move with greater flexibility, because otherwise these are just going to become cumbersome formations, which is not how they're described. So I've tried to represent all the cavalry on both sides as not one big block, but as lots of troops, squadrons, equivalents like that in the various different formations, spread out, gaps between them. Polybius later on talks about cavalry needing twice the space of the same number of infantry to operate effectively. That doesn't mean each individual horse and rider needs 6 foot as opposed to the 3 foot frontage of a man. It's that you want space between the individual subunits. Because cavalry combats are always whirling affairs, and Granicus will be no exception. People charge forward, they might succeed, they then pursue the enemy, their formation gets broken up, they scatter, they meet enemy reserves, they get chased back, but then your own reserves chase the enemy that are chasing you, and back and forth. Ancient accounts and more modern accounts from the Napoleonic Wars, for instance, always give this impression of whirling combats back and forth, and the person who wins tends to be the one who charges in the most controlled way and keeps the most reserves, freshest, strongest, under control, able to be committed, and pushes the enemy back. You get your cavalry into a big mass, as happened with the French cavalry at Waterloo, as the unit structures break down in their successive charges against the Allied squares. They become less and less effective, less and less controllable, and much, much harder to rally afterwards, because you don't know where anybody is. So what the Persians were doing would be deploying in a much wider formation, not simply in a block, but just lines the river bank. Because also, cavalry, unlike infantry, don't want to be right there at the edge. They want to wait for the enemy to be disordered as they come up the bank and then hit them then, either surging forward to throw missiles or surging forward to charge if the enemy looks vulnerable enough. So cavalry needs space. If the Persian cavalry really were deployed like this, it suggests that at this stage you're thinking of a demonstration of force. You're showing confidence to the enemy, but you aren't actually thinking of fighting a battle today at all. Because as I say, if you're doing that, you'd have your infantry holding the riverbank. So unless the Persians have only just got here, and the infantry haven't arrived, haven't got a chance to do that, in which case you're a covering force, so that might give Alexander an opportunity. But really, if you're not expecting a battle, then the whole moral question of let's hit them hard from the very start becomes all the more appealing, all the more powerful from Alexander's perspective. Go in, clobber them soon, because they're not ready, they're not expecting, and you're going to show just how much contempt you have for them. We are better than you, we are going to smash you, we can attack you under any circumstances, and we're going to win. The other interesting thing is that when the battle begins, a lot of the Persian commanders seem to be concentrated, which again rather suggests that they're having a conference. They're not expecting to fight now. They're looking at the enemy, getting an idea of what they're like and thinking, well, maybe tomorrow we'll fight or maybe not. We'll see what they do. So you wouldn't have your cavalry lining the bank. You might bring them further forward than you would in a proper deployment because you want to intimidate the enemy by basically it's a show of force. Look, we're not frightened of you. We're coming up. We're going to jeer at you. We're going to gesture at you, and you'll have to stand there the other side of the river and take it. And then sometime soon we'll fight you when situation suits us. So for me, this is a situation where the Persians aren't expecting battle at all, and they're not deployed for it. And even though Alexander is gambling, breaking the rules by attacking under these circumstances where he is at a disadvantage, having to lead his men across the river first, nevertheless, there's an opportunity there because the enemy are not ready for him. He is not attacking a carefully prepared position. Yes, the ground gives the enemy an advantage, but they're not deployed to make the most out of that. So I think it all makes sense for a direct attack, and probably that, yes, there's a cliche of this, older, wiser heads tell the brash young king, or you should do it this way, the brash young kid, to be the sort of epitome of cool. Nope, I'm going to do it my way, and of course goes and wins. So the king decides he's going to attack. The Macedonian army prepares for battle. You have the sacrifices, all the ceremonies that go before, and then Alexander mounts his horse and leads the advance. Later in the battle, the horse he's riding is killed, which means that's obviously not Bucephalus that lives on for a long time. Probably he starts the battle on Bucephalus. That would be our assumption, but obviously none of the sources say this, so there's an element of guesswork in that. He leads off his attendants, the close companions, bodyguards, moves to the right of the army. The crowd, he looked distinctive. The Persians are going to know who he is. Memnon could probably recognize him by sight. Memnon is with the other Persian leaders. He's not with the mercenary infantry back on the hill. Again, a suggestion that he's not planning on fighting at this point. They'd be able to point Alexander out. He would stand out because he's conspicuously dressed, his cloak, his helmet with his plumes, and the fact that there's all this attention and this is the guy out in front. So they know who he is, and then Arrian says they deliberately mass squadrons opposite where they think Alexander's going to be and where he's going to cross. So the attack is led by these lighter cavalry, the Protomoi, Paeonians, and this one squadron under Socrates of companion cavalry. It was their turn to lead the advance that day, lead the march that day, so that's why they're forward. And then there's a taxis of infantry, you assume, the hypaspists, all under the command of Amyntas. So he's got a brigade group almost within the force, and put somebody in charge. And again, that's the pattern in all of Alexander's battles. Because he's going to lead from the front, because he's going to get involved in the combat, the army is divided up. There are area commanders, sub-commanders at every stage who are allowed immense initiative to do what they feel is right. And at the very least, if you advance this force, you'll find out whether the river really is fordable or not. So it's a probing attack at this stage that then develops into a full-scale attack. The final decision to commit to all-out attack may not have been made until Alexander knows, oh, actually, yeah, we can get across this. So these start across. Alexander gets to the main body of companion cavalry, does signal the general advance. So everybody's following up. So if it is viable, they're going to be able to follow up quickly. So there's a degree of commitment, the expectation, yes, we can get across this. Yes, it'll be fine. The spearhead has gone through the river, splashing through. You'd assume they're using the most clearly defined ford, the one that travelers that trade normally uses along this well-established route within the empire. The Persians are waiting. The cavalry of the Macedonians seem to go faster than the infantry. It's easier for them. The Persians start to throw javelins down from the high banks. So some of them are close to the banks, but again, this is not a great posture for a cavalryman. Other units come down closer, come towards the bank, start throwing missiles. Fresh squadrons move up on either side because they can see, all right, the enemy's coming here. This is where the fight's going to be. There's a tendency to suck in a lot of the defenders, a lot of these individual units of cavalry we see here on this map, to face this first obvious threat and get the glory of defeat, being the one to meet the Macedonians and beat them first. Memnon and his sons lead their own horsemen into the fight. This squadron of companions loses 25 men in the fighting, probably a lot of them in this fairly early stage, although we don't know that for certain. The spearhead units get pushed back. They can't fight their way up onto the bank, but they've drawn the attention of a lot of the Persians. They've sucked in a lot of the troops there. And again, the closer you get to the bank, the less mobility your Persian cavalry units have, particularly if others come in support and cluster too closely around them. Alexander's taken the main force into the channel and then the river, but is veering towards the right against the strong current. Remember, that's coming towards the sea from the mountains to the south. Presumably trying to find a way across, seeing what's there, because they don't know the detail till they get there. And also he seems to be trying to form them into a line as they're crossing in the river, so that this is a more serious attack, which again suggests that it's not that difficult. The horses are wading more than they're swimming. The line's going to be ragged, but it can form in some respect. And then at the head of the royal squadron, which may be stronger than the others, he charges headlong into the thickest of the Persians, finding a way up the bank. Again, they're looking for routes up the bank to get there. The remainder of armies wading across as best they could. Formations no doubt going to be ragged, disrupted, and again searching for the easiest route across, searching for the places where they can climb the bank the other side. So that's going to affect a lot of what's going on, and we don't have the detail of just how this shapes things. You have a pattern in the descriptions of all of Alexander's battles, in that it begins with Alexander, why he's here, how he decides to fight, and usually the whole words of caution from his commanders: no, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to attack. Or before Gaugamela, Parmenio advised a night attack: no, I won't steal victory, I'm going to attack under the broad sun. You get then the wider view of the army, the deployment that's often described in considerable detail, particularly by Arrian. So obviously comes from his sources. You get the initial attacks, decisions and maneuvers, but then increasingly the narrative focuses on Alexander to the exclusion of everybody else. So you get the advance happens, the people attack, that advance guard, everybody is starting to advance across the river. You move to Alexander and the rest of the companion cavalry. Then you move to Alexander at the head of the royal squadron, the royal illa, the royal regiment, call it what you will, of companion cavalry, and focuses on him. And then eventually it will narrow down to Alexander himself and the men immediately around him, which means we don't get a lot of detail and we have to guess what's happening elsewhere on the field. So it's a focus that's a lot like a lot of movies, in that you might have the big sweep, the big setting up, the grand spectacle, but then it tends to come down to our main characters and what they're doing and how they fare. So the fighting is very confused, which means that any description of it was probably going to be, at best, fairly rough. This is for several reasons. Cavalry combats are always like this. We've said before, they're whirling backwards and forwards, beat the enemy, get chased back, chase him back in turn, and so on and so on. In this case, it's a lot more confused because the formations have been broken up, and the Persians are going to be a lot less neat as they are on the bank, some of them coming down into the river to fight, as some of the Macedonians are forcing their way up. Generally speaking, and I'll put a few pictures up of me on horseback showing my sack of potatoes posture that I managed to perfect over several years of learning. Horses like to surge up. They see a slope, they love to run up it. It's much easier to get a horse to go up a slope than it is to go down. Down, they're less well balanced, and the rider on them even more so. It's just the way their body's shaped. So a bank like that, I've come across a ford on a river, and the horse will spring up the bank the other side, even when it's quite steep, especially if there's looks like a sort of clear way route to do it. I always remember I used to ride past quite often a road that goes in the middle of a golf course, and on one side of it there was this absolutely beautiful green and hole that sort of ran up a slope, and every time you really had to hold the horses in because they just wanted to go through that gate that was usually left open and gallop up that. And it would have been lovely. And when I walk past it now, I haven't ridden for a while, when I walk past on foot, I still get that same urge that, oh, I'd love to have a horse and I'd love to just give him his head up there. They like going upwards. They like saying, to the advantage for horses, unlike men, when they're fighting on foot, is actually the unit that's coming up the slope in many respects, especially a short thing like a bank, has an advantage. The horse is going to want to do that. And it comes back to this, horses are not, they don't like to stand somewhere and sort of be rock solid. They're not like, they don't form a wall. They don't want to push back in the same way that men might. So the advantage in many respects, the more the Persians are drawn towards the riverbank, the more in surprising ways the advantage comes to the Macedonians. And the horses are going to push their way and barge their way up, and the ones that are static are more likely to move out of the way of the ones that are moving and surging up towards them. And it's going to be noisy and it's going to be confusing. You think of the comment from the fellow witnessing a cavalry melee at Waterloo of like 1,000 coppersmiths at work all at the same time. Some of the other troops, the Agrianians, the archers, they're coming up to support. It's confused. It's primarily a mounted battle because the Persian infantry are still way, way away on the top of the hill. And the Macedonians are making their way forward because they're more aggressive. You add in the fact that they are equipped and their doctrine, their ideology is about hand-to-hand close combat, charging home, thrusting with your spear and then following up with your sword if you need to, into the faces, into the chests of the enemy. Persian cavalry is much more harass the enemy, wear him down, and then charge home and kill him when he's weak. So they've got longer spears, which give them an advantage. They're more aggressive, which gives them an advantage. And one of the sources talks about them thrusting at the faces, the chests, the heads of the horses. They're starting to make contact. The numbers in contact fairly soon will be round about equal because the Persians can't get more people onto the spots where the Macedonians are crossing. And all this extra cavalry is fine, but when you're denying it the mobility, the back and forth, the come in, fight in relays, you're actually fighting at, you're negating your biggest advantage in terms of numbers. So the horses will surge up, the Persians give way, the Macedonians start to gather in groups on the eastern bank of the river. Probably fairly ragged ones, probably not very neat, bits and bobs, not perhaps the neat wedges we've got there, though they might be roughly trying to get into that. Whoever can rally in one spot, and then they're meeting the Persians that have lost their neat formation, but they're still in groups, in squadrons, in troops, who are trying to get in at you. But again, it's hard for all of them to come in at one time. So we develop into a different stage of the fighting, but it's at this point very much so that the narratives come to focus on Alexander and Alexander alone. So the accounts very much shift their focus, just like a movie. Suddenly the camera pans in and all we see from now on is our hero and everything else is in the background. So if we look at just Plutarch's and Arrian's account of what happened round about now, let's start with Plutarch. For the enemy pressed upon them with loud shouts, and matching horse with horse, plied their lances and their swords when their lances were shattered. Many rushed upon Alexander, for he was conspicuous by his buckler and by his helmet crest, on either side of which was fixed a plume of wonderful size and whiteness. But though a javelin pierced the joint of his breastplate, he was not wounded. And when Rosicles and Spithridates, two Persian commanders, made at him together, he avoided the one and smote Rosicles, who wore a breastplate, with his spear. When this weapon snapped in two with a blow, he took to his sword. Then, while he was thus engaged with Rosicles, Spithridates rode up from one side, raised himself up on his horse, with all his might came down with a barbarian battle-axe upon Alexander's head. Alexander's crest was broken off together with one of its plumes, and his helmet could barely and with difficulty resist the blow, so that the edge of the battle-axe touched the topmost hair of his head. But while Spithridates was raising his arm again for another stroke, Clitus, Black Clitus, got the start of him and ran him through the body with his spear. At the same time, Rosicles also fell, smitten by Alexander's sword. Then the Arrian version of presumably the same events. At this point in the melee, Alexander's lance was broken in the battle. He called on Aretas, a groom of the royal suite, for another, but Aretas had also snapped his lance and was hard pressed, though putting up a grave fight with the half of his broken weapon. Showing this to Alexander, he told him to call on someone else. Demaratus of Corinth, one of his companions, gave him his own lance. Alexander grasped it, and seeing Mithridates, son-in-law of Darius, riding ahead of the line and leading a wedge-shaped body of horse, charged out alone in advance of his own men, thrust his lance into Mithridates' face, and hurled him to the ground. Then Rosicles rode at Alexander and struck him on the head with his scimitar. Though he sheared off part of the helmet, still the helmet parried the blow. Alexander hurled him to the ground, piercing with his lance through the cuirass into the chest. Spithridates already raised his scimitar against Alexander from behind when Clitus, son of Dropides, slipping in first, struck Spithridates' shoulder with his sword and cut it off. Meanwhile, cavalry who made good their way downstream kept coming up and joining the band around Alexander. So those are two versions. There are variations in the various accounts. So you have the story of Alexander with his broken spear, his Xyston. a long lance, but normally held one-handed in the right hand. And because it had to be manageable, a fairly slim shaft that could snap in these circumstances, looks around and one of his closest attendants says, sorry, sire, I've already broken mine. I'm a bit busy at the moment. Demaratus of Corinth, who's singled out in Arrian's account, is an interesting character because he's not Macedonian, he's Corinthian. He's an older man. He's one of Philip's favourites. He is the man who is credited in some traditions with having persuaded Philip to recall Alexander from the voluntary exile he'd gone into when he and his mother had fallen out of favour. And the disputes over Philip's marriage and the drunken argument they have. So Demaratus has been an important figure behind this. And so whether he or somebody close to him is the source of this tradition that shows him being heroic at this point as well, we don't know. So you have fighting, and then it seems to be, in Arrian's account, Plutarch's is much more rushed together. But then he says at the start of the biography that he's more interested in personality, in the comments somebody made, the jokes they made, and their actions rather than the broader sweep of battles and tactics and all this sort of thing. Arrian, we're using different sources and writing a much longer account in more detail with different priorities, focuses more on the tactics and that aspect of things. Although again, not too much. We are still very much focused on Alexander. He says there's clearly open, he says that the space, the implication is Alexander's rallying a knot of horsemen around him. There's space in front. He sees Mithridates, son-in-law of Darius, and with cavalrymen, groups of Persians coming towards him. Whether he recognized him individually as, oh, that's Mithridates, or whether this is a prominent Persian nobleman looking impressive, just as Alexander himself looks impressive, steams forward towards him, and ahead of his followers who are just galloping to keep up, rushing to keep up. And the Persians had no doubt that he was determined to kill him, whether it was part of he's clearly going for the leader of the enemy group, and then that enemy group plus other distinguished Persians who seem to be close enough or in the area are then depicted as closing on Alexander with the same idea. Remember, one of these men, Mithridates, is one of the satraps. So these are big figures within the Persian nobility. Now, whether there's always been a concerted plan to kill Alexander, take him out, or whether this is simply opportunistic, after all, we've had the bit earlier on where they're supposed to adjust, concentrate their forces to where they see the king going, moving along to conform. It's a fairly logical thing to do. These are aristocrats themselves, eager for the glory of taking out the enemy king, the enemy aristocrats, the same idea, but also Alexander is the leader. Take him out and you will seriously cripple the Macedonian army because there's no obvious successor at this point. So Alexander rides towards Mithridates, drives his spear into him, kills him. Rosaces is there, the brother of Mithridates. He comes close, hacks down with a sword or an axe, depending on the account. And anyway, these words are often a little bit vague and made to sound a bit more exotic. The Persians have slightly more outlandish, uncouth weapon types in the Greek, just to give an impression that these are foreign, these are barbarian. Diodorus actually claims the blow breaks the metal. I didn't quote his account, but it's generally speaking, his battle account is a lot less convincing than everybody else's and a lot more confused. You'd think that wouldn't happen unless the helmet was very badly made, but of course you never quite know with these things. Tests are all very well when you say, well, this is somebody striking a helmet of this manufacture with a weapon of this type using so many joules of energy. You have to allow for the adrenaline. In fact, you have to allow for the quirk that even what looked like a really high quality piece might have a flaw in it that people would not know about. And that 1,000,000 to 1 that you happen to strike at just the right angle, at just the right moment, with just the right force to exploit any weakness in it. But probably you think, generally speaking, this would be unlikely. Maybe this is exaggeration, but there again, what are the helmets we're testing? Are they actually accurate for what Alexander's wearing? Arrian has it strike part of it off. Plutarch talks about the crest and the side plume going. and that perhaps the helmet twisted, gave a slight cut to the head. Maybe it's that sort of thing rather than actually penetrating through the metal, or some impact depending on what Alexander's got underneath the helmet, what is using to cushion it, some injury, but not an incapacitating one. In Diodorus, he's knocked down off his horse and unconscious. Alexander then thrusts his spear into the man ahead of him, Rosicles, and knocks him from his horse, which again, the whole question of saddles at this period is difficult. There's not direct evidence for what will become clearly standard usage by the next century, but what's going on now, whether the Macedonians did have some early form of saddle, or whether they are still relying largely on saddlecloths and this sort of thing, blankets, and just being very good, basically bareback riders. But in this sort of fighting without stirrups and things, the chances of falling from your seat are stronger than they would be in later periods when you've got a full saddle and stirrups, but even then it can happen in those periods as well. While he's doing that, this Rosicles, who's presumably dead, dying, incapacitated at this point, his brother Spithridates is working around behind Alexander, around the flank, raises his own blade. Alexander doesn't see it, but Black Clitus does. Of course, the great irony is that it's Black Clitus that Alexander will murder in a drunken rage, run a spear through him a few years later. He's commander of the royal squadron. He's a little bit faster. It's that reaction time that he cuts the arm off of the Persian. So he's using a sword. So he's lost his Zeiston, presumably his lance by this time. And more Macedonians come up around them. They fight off the other Persians. The danger's over. In the accounts, the impression is that this is when the Persian cavalry is starting to give way. They've lost a few of their leaders. That's going to dismay them, as it would have done had Alexander had fallen for the Macedonians. There seemed to be a lot of casualties amongst the leaders both here. There's also a sense of Persians being killed and some Macedonians being killed along the rest of the line. So Alexander and his men have fought their way forward in the main attack he's led. The vanguard was initially repulsed. Whether that's also returned to the fray, quite possibly. The other parts of the army are making their way up the bank. The Persians are suffering losses. The Macedonians some, but not so many. They're better protected, as we'll come on to later. It rather suggests the Thessalians, Parmenio, units of the phalanx as well, perhaps, have all been in the fight. And of course, as more and more infantry come up, and if they can get onto the bank, particularly pikemen in any sort of order, that's not something that Persian cavalry is going to be able to face very well from the front. So the pressure builds up, and it looks as if the Persian cavalry flees along with its remaining leaders, or all the important ones, and leaves the infantry behind. For Arrian, the infantry that he depicts as exclusively, really, or at least predominantly the mercenaries, the Greeks, are sort of mesmerized by the speed of this collapse. Again, that can happen very quickly, especially with lots of cavalry, because again, they can get away very, very fast. And the Persian infantry, consisting to a great extent of Greek mercenaries, but perhaps other troops as well, at least some of them are quickly surrounded by elements of the Macedonian army. You have the phalanx attacking them from the front, cavalry threatening them on the flanks and the rear. Arrian presents this as a massacre, very one-sided, even though, again, there are casualties at this point. Alexander loses his horse. He is still there fighting. The assumption is, as we say, that either he hasn't ridden Bucephalus at the start, or he's ridden him up to this point, changes to a fresh mount, and that's the mount that gets killed. 2,000 mercenaries are taken prisoner, so that gives an idea of the overall numbers. The rest are cut down. Even though they're Greeks, these 2,000 are sent off to a life of slavery and working in the mines and this sort of thing. So they're not treated well because they have fought against Alexander and the coalition of the Greek states, the hegemon leading them. A literal reading of Arrian would then imply that, well, the other 18,000 out of these 20,000 were massacred. But that assumes that nobody ran away, nobody got away. It also assumes that all of them were Greeks in the first place. We don't know. It probably was much more of a one-sided fight, but not entirely so, again, given the death of Alexander's horse. Overall, the Persian cavalry are said to have lost 1,000 dead, 8 of their senior officers, senior nobility. So that's a lot in this hand-to-hand fighting, including to, at least it's claimed, in Alexander's own hands. Arsaces, the senior satrap, escaped but commits suicide soon afterwards, presumably feels he's going to be blamed for this. Memnon got away, he fights against the Macedonians as well. We've mentioned already that from Socrates' squadron of the companion cavalry, 25 are killed. They're given bronze statues back at Dium in Macedonia. Arrian also says another 60 cavalrymen, not clear if those are just companions or include Thessalians, Paeonians and others as well, died, along with about 30 infantry. So that doesn't necessarily sound as a lot. That's what, 115 in total fatalities out of an army of 20,000 or so, perhaps a bit more, 20, 25,000 probably, for the elements of the Macedonians, the Thessalians and others that are there. So it's a comparatively small number, but two things to point out. One is that in ancient battles, the victor often loses comparatively few losses and the loser suffers disproportionately highly. The Persian cavalry have the advantage. They do lose 1,000, but they could have been a lot more if they didn't all have horses and got away. And while the Macedonians are dealing with the Persian infantry and the Greek mercenaries and everything, the Persian cavalry have a very good chance to make their getaway, and mostly do. So that would be a 10% loss amongst the cavalry if there are only 10,000 of them, and 5% if there's 20,000, which is not high by the standards of losing armies in the ancient world. It's still pretty severe, though. And that's the thing. There is a tendency, scholars can often be rather bloodthirsty, and they like high numbers for losses, and they imagine battles as rather more lethal than they really were. You have to think that no figures are given for the wounded in this action by Arrian or by Plutarch, or Macedonian wounded, that is. In other cases, the wounded always outnumber the fatalities by 2, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 or 10. By that degree. It seems to testify to the good protection that Macedonian helmets and armor offered to them in the face of the weapons deployed against them by the Persians and other enemies. It's also a general reflection. It's your limbs which are exposed, they will tend to get hit. And the Macedonians seem to have been quite a tough lot. They live to old ages if they don't get murdered. And they seem to recover quite well. You always wonder if there's some genetic fluke where the lifestyle, the stock they're from, whatever it is, creates a particularly tough generation or so that seem to recover and don't succumb to blood poisoning quite as often as we might expect. So again, we don't get the numbers. The losses to horses are probably even higher. We do get descriptions of Alexander going around the wounded, talking to them, listening to them as well. That great leader element that's emphasized, this man who had at times a great ability to read his men, understand them, and then at other times would completely misread them. He also treats the corpses of the Greek mercenaries with respect, as he does those of the Persian nobles. So once the Greeks are dead, that's fine. The ones who surrender go off into slavery. So that is the end of the Battle of the Granicus. It's broken the only field army the Persians are able to assemble in Western Asia, and Alexander isn't going to face another major battle for a year. There'll be lots of fighting, but it's nearly all in and around cities. It's mostly sieges that dominate from now on, and rapid movement, raids, surprises, and trying to convince everybody to defect to him. As it works out, this is the fillip, the spark that really ignites Alexander's campaign and gives it momentum. This is a victory. It's a very clear victory in which the king himself has played a conspicuous, dangerous, but important part. He has led the way. The companions have followed their king, both the horse companions and the foot companions. The Macedonians, as a people with a few favoured allies like the Thessalians, have fought, have confronted the best the enemy could throw at them in this area, and they've taken them on bold-headed and they've hammered them. And Alexander has led them. So it's an important stage for Alexander to prove that he's got the guts to follow Philip, and he's also got the luck to follow Philip and the ability to follow Philip. He has given them victory. He's ignored some of his advice, he's done what he thought was right, and it has worked. This is the start of that process that is much more gradual than we tend to assume, of turning Philip's army and the Macedonian army into Alexander's army. and that will be completed as he replaces more and more of the commanders. But also as men get used to campaigning under him and winning with Alexander and starting to win victories more spectacular than anything Philip has done. Granicus isn't really that sort of battle. It is small compared to the others. He doesn't fight Darius, he doesn't fight the great king, he fights his local representatives, his satraps. The Persians don't seem to expect a battle and do seem to mishandle it. The deployment doesn't make a lot of sense if they really were expecting a serious attack. And it becomes very much a let's take down Alexander and a scrappy fight. There's not a lot of subtle tactics in this, even in the initial attack. You know, you can look at the maneuverings at Gaugamela, at Issus to an extent as well, and start to see some sense of a plan. It's a lot simpler and cruder at the Granicus. It is more about going straight at them and just showing, I'm better than you, we're better than you, we're going to win, fear us. It was, of course, a massive risk for Alexander the Great, because, as so nearly happened, he could have been killed or crippled in that melee surrounding him. If Black Clitus had been a little bit slower, then a second blow to the head, to the shoulders, to the neck could well have felled him, could well have killed him. Either way, if Alexander is incapacitated or dead, what do the Macedonians do? You have only his half-brother, who will later succeed him, but is considered to be mentally, physically unfit, doesn't have the ability ever to become a great leader. Oh, then you've got the, what's left? There's not a lot of the royal family. They've been killing each other for generations. There is no other heir. It's one of those things you get in the sources, and sometimes modern scholars will comment on it as well, that Alexander ought to have married before he left Macedonia. But even if he'd done that, and even if the wife had got pregnant almost immediately and happened to have a son that lived, that child would have been an infant, would not have been capable of succeeding. So whatever Alexander had done, he couldn't have provided a viable heir for 10, 15 years or so. That's fairly generous, because it takes that time for somebody to grow up, even if everything goes right in terms of a child being born that proves to be a boy and then proves to be capable, physically and mentally suited to being a king. So that doesn't really work. He is a gambler, and there is a gamble in saying, well, I'm not going to die, I'm not going to need an heir. In the same way, when he leads in this way at Granicus, he's showing what he's made of to the veterans of his father. This is far more important a role than the one he's played at Chaeronea, or in any of the fighting in the early part of his reign, back in Greece and in the border tribes, against the border tribes. If it fails, the campaign is over, and the Persians can rest easy, even if they lose the battle. If Alexander dies, then probably the Macedonians are going to bicker about who's going to be the next king, and the odds are the coalition's going to fall apart, and the army's going to evacuate and go home, or not achieve very much. It certainly isn't going to drive on as relentlessly as it would under Alexander, his restless energy there and his ambition. So it's a big risk, and it will continue to be a risk, because Alexander could lose this war in an instant at any stage by getting himself killed or crippled in these battles. So when he fights from the front, when he leads from the front, that risk to him, even though you've got all these tough companions around him, even though you've got somebody like Black Clitus there to save the day, again, fraction of a second later, maybe he wouldn't have protected Alexander. If Alexander dies, it's over. But then everybody knows that. So again, it's that sense of the confidence, the belief that, well, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to get killed, I'm not going to get crippled, I'm going to keep on attacking, I'm going to keep on fighting this way, and we're going to keep winning. Starts to build up that incredible confidence that they have that will take them through all sorts of challenges in the years to come. So it's an interesting action. It's probably best not to see it in the situation. Yes, they'll cross a bit of a stream at the Issus, but it's probably less of an obstacle than the Granicus, and that's a different type of battle and a much bigger battle on both sides. And then the Persians are properly prepared to defend that position with overwhelmingly infantry on the far bank of the river, some cases with entrenchments, field fortifications put up to protect them again. So the gamble has paid off for Alexander at Granicus, and the war will go on. It's an interesting action because it tells us a bit about the Macedonian army, it tells us about Alexander, it tells us about how the Persians are thinking and acting, and also gives a flavour for how the sources will treat Alexander's battles, in that you get remarkable detail on certain aspects, on deployment, on the units, the unit commanders, what's going on, and then huge gaps where the focus just turns to something else, usually to Alexander himself, very narrowly around him, and doesn't tell us anything at all. As I say, we know because there are casualties among them that Parmenion and his men are also fighting on the left flank, but there's no description of it. And even at the Issus and Gaugamela, much less is said about what's going on there and elsewhere along the line. You get bits, but there's nowhere near as much about what compared to what Alexander is actually doing. So here's the latest in our look at individual ancient battles. We'll continue doing this, and we'll every now and again do a more modern action as well, something that draws my attention. So that's it for today. The Battle of Granicus, Alexander's first victory as king and the first victory as commander in a field battle, a big action, and the start really, what gives the Persian campaign that momentum, gives the Macedonians confidence, means that more and more cities will defect to them so they get the supplies that they need so that they can actually prosecute the campaign, and probably they start to get the transport animals and things they need as well. So everything goes up a gear from here. And Alexander, like Philip before him, will not rest during the winter months when campaigning normally stopped. He will keep going nearly all the time. And there's a relentlessness about his offensive from now on that surprises the Persians as it would surprise anybody else. This is new. This is a different type of army. And we can focus very much on the sarissai of the phalangites, the use of the pike phalanx, the companion cavalry, the way that the different elements within the Macedonian army became this sort of all-arms force that had different tactics, different equipment, but fights very well as a team. All of that's very important and very interesting, but there's another element, the strategic element, that, again, we're reminded of the fact that these battles are rare. It's very good at fighting battles, it's that sort of army, but it's also very good at campaigning, moving fast, marching hard, covering a lot of ground, and sieges. Particularly good at taking walls, strongholds. The enemy is no longer safe. They can't just wait for you to start to suffer from disease and shortage of supplies and then go away. They're not starving you out. They're going to come over those walls or under those walls or through those walls and get to you. Again, those are other things we'll talk about. We'll probably do a few sieges in these talks on individual actions as well. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.